Welcome to the second session of CMJ's Spring Bible Week. I'm Jane Moxon, and it's my pleasure to welcome back tonight's speaker, Professor Sir Colin Humphreys. He is Professor of Materials Science at Queen Mary University of London, Emeritus Goldsmiths Professor of Materials Science at the University of Cambridge, where he worked for 30 years, a Fellow of Selwyn College, Cambridge, and an Honorary Fellow of Churchill College, Cambridge. He was knighted in 2010 for services to science. In 2011, Colin became a Fellow of the Royal Society. The Royal Society is a fellowship of many of the world's most eminent scientists and is the oldest scientific academy in continuous existence. He's also a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and has many more awards. But one of the things that captured my imagination when I met Colin in Cambridge in early March was his work on graphene. It's a material I'd never heard of, but it's a honeycomb structure made from carbon and it's 1 atom thick. So it's dead flat or two-dimensional, and it's stronger than steel. I took my pencil and made a line. So that's graphene. Colin said, that's about 100 layers of graphene. You can't see graphene with the naked eye, but once made, they can pick it up with tweezers. Apparently, if you think of a millimeter, which is hard enough to see, it would take about 3 million layers of graphene to reach 1 millimeter. It's the thinnest known material in the world, and our world is fascinating. And I think that you're going to find Colin's talk this evening more fascinating than even graphene. Was there a blood-red moon on the evening of the Crucifixion? Thank you, Colin.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, for that very kind introduction. And this is the second talk of this series of 3 talks. And I'm going to ask the question, was there a blood-red moon on the evening of the Crucifixion? And this was the conclusion of the previous talk. Well, what we did, we looked at the possible dates for the Crucifixion between AD 26 and 36, and we used a sort of elimination method to rule out each of these dates because they didn't fit the facts and the biblical description, also external biblical evidence. So we ruled them all out apart from one date which fitted all the available evidence, and that was Friday the 3rd of April, AD 33 at 3 p.m. So all the evidence fitted this date and only this date. And now we're going to look at a very different way of dating the crucifixion, and it's a sort of positive method of dating the crucifixion, and it's tentative, and certainly when we first proposed this, it was controversial. So let's start with the speech that Peter made on the Festival of Pentecost, and it's recorded in Acts chapter 2. And, you know, Pentecost is just 50 days after the Feast of Passover. That's why it's called Pente, because of 50. And this is what Peter said. And the context of it is that the disciples had been meeting for the Feast of Pentecost. They'd been meeting in a room, and suddenly there was a rushing wind, is what Acts says. And Acts says that tongues as if of fire landed on the head of each one of them, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. And they started talking, not in strange tongues, in fact, but in other people's languages. And then they dashed out into the streets and started talking to these crowds which were assembled there in these variety of languages. And the people, many of them said, these people are drunk. But Peter says, no, they're not drunk. This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And you can just imagine the atmosphere when he said this, because what Peter's saying is, this day, prophecy is being fulfilled, right? So it's a remarkable start to a speech. So as this day, prophecy is being fulfilled. And then he says, in the last days, God says, I'll pour out my spirit on all people. I will show wonders in the heavens above. The sun will return to darkness and the moon to blood before that great and glorious day of the Lord shall come, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So what does Peter mean? Well, this is just 50 days after the crucifixion. I put strange tongues here, but actually it's known tongues rather than strange tongues. And they were accused of being drunk. And Peter actually starts by saying, it's the third hour. Now, we saw yesterday that the hours of daylight were the hours of daylight were measured from sunrise. And sunrise at this sort of time of the year is at about 6 a.m. So the third hour is 9 a.m. So what Peter's saying is, these people aren't drunk. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. And today he'd say the pubs aren't open, all right? These people are quite sober and they're just behaving in an exuberant way. And then Peter says, let me explain this to you. And then biblical commentators are divided as to what Peter meant. And about half the commentators say that Peter meant all this Joel prophecy has recently been fulfilled, because Peter says, let me explain this to you. And people like F.F. Bruce say that. And that's actually the natural interpretation of what Peter is saying. But some people say it refers largely to the future. But that doesn't correspond to that, to what Peter is saying. You know, this is today, this prophecy has been fulfilled. And he didn't stop the prophecy halfway, as it were. He tells the whole prophecy. So if we just look at what he means, then when the New Testament talks about the last days, in these last days, the last days started with the coming of Jesus. So that's when the last days started. Then the outpouring of the Spirit that Joel talks about is identified by Peter with Pentecost. That great and glorious day, at the end of what Peter quotes, is the resurrection, since which time everyone who calls on the Lord, on Jesus, will be saved. And then the sun was turned to darkness. Now, the people there would have seen the Gospels record, seen what the Gospels record, that the sun was turned to darkness for 3 hours at the crucifixion. If you want a natural mechanism for this, there's an apocryphal book called the Sibylline Oracles, and that says dust was brought down at midday. And this is a reference to Jesus. And so specifically, the Sibylline Oracles says a dust storm. And I have been in a dust storm in the Middle East. I think I was in Kuwait, in fact, and I was out of my hotel and I saw ahead of me down the street this, well, dark cloud going from, the ground right up as far as you can see into the sky. And it just rolled towards me and people shouted, hotel, get in hotel. So I got in the hotel, and the hotel had these sliding doors, which are pretty well sealed, but the sand just got through the seal. And it was a beautiful sunny day when I got into the hotel room, and it was totally pitch black afterwards. The sun was totally blotted out. So a sunstorm is a possible mechanism, if you want a mechanism, for the sun turned to darkness. But then the same evening, the moon was turned to blood, is what Peter says, before that great and glorious day, which is the resurrection. So let's just pick out this strange phrase, the moon was turned to blood, which Peter is saying happened at the crucifixion and before the resurrection. So are there any other references to this? Well, I found two. So one is in an apocryphal book called The Report of Pilate. And this is what the Report of Pilate says. Jesus was delivered to him by Herod, Archelaus, Philip, Annas, Caiaphas, and all the people. At his crucifixion, the sun was darkened. People lighted lamps from the 6th hour till evening. The moon appeared like blood. Now, people are divided as to whether this is a Christian forgery or not, and we just don't know. If it's genuine, then this report of Pilate is saying the moon appeared like blood. If it's a Christian forgery, then that suggests that it was a tradition of the crucifixion, the moon appeared like blood, or else just, why say it? So that's a second place where it is said at the crucifixion, the moon appeared like blood. And there's a third place I found, and this is a Bishop Cyril of Alexandria in AD 412, but he's writing a commentary of what happened at the crucifixion. And this is what he says. He says, After saying there was darkness at the crucifixion, he said something unusual occurred about the circular rotation of the moon, that it even seemed to be turned into blood. So these are tiny fragments of evidence, which on their own, you couldn't put much weight on. But when the three of them come together, then it's suggestive that the moon did indeed appear like blood, or may indeed appear like blood on the evening of crucifixion. So we've got the Acts of the Apostles, reports of Pilate, and Cyril of Alexandria. So we have quite strong evidence from the Acts, and then weaker evidence from the reports of Pilate and Cyril of Alexandria, but they all support each other. So what does the moon turn to blood mean? Well, I think most of us in the audience probably know it refers to a lunar eclipse. But a key question is, did ancient writers use this phrase to describe a lunar eclipse? So what I did, I searched for ancient literature, which is not that difficult when you've got an internet as well. But these are some of the references. So this was a lunar eclipse. Well, okay, this was from A History of Alexander by Quintus Curtius. And he says, 2 days after Alexander crossed the Tigris, the moon was suffused with the color of blood. Now we know from the history books when this occurred, when Alexander crossed the Tigris, we know 2 days when this occurred. We can do the astronomical calculations, and there was indeed a lunar eclipse on that evening. So this was a lunar eclipse on the 20th of September, 331 BC. And so we know that when Quintus Curtius says the moon was suffused with the color of blood, it was a lunar eclipse. And then somewhat similarly, at martyrdom of Bishop Felix, Acta Sanctorum says, when he was about to be martyred, the moon was turned to blood. And again, we know this date from Acta Sanctorum, do the astronomy, and we find this was a lunar eclipse of 31 of August, AD 304. I've just got a few more here. Lunar eclipse of 2nd of March, AD 462. This is from the Hydatius Lemitus Chronicon. On March 2, with the crowing of cocks, after the setting of the sun, the full moon was turned to blood. And just another reference here. This is coming up to 1848, 19th of March. The British consul in Ghent, who did not know there was an eclipse, wrote to me for an explanation of the blood-red colour of the moon at 9 o'clock. And this was a guy called Forster, who was a government minister at the time. So we have all these references to lunar eclipses, and there are many more. So basically, in ancient literature, when you see the phrase the moon turned to blood, it means a lunar eclipse. It was the way they described it. There's a nice story about Christopher Columbus. I'll just mention this in case you don't know it. So Christopher Columbus was shipwrecked, and they were running out of food, and the natives would bring them food, and the sailors on the ships would give them various trinkets. If they've got rings, they give them rings, they give them their hats and so on. And the natives became more and more demanding, and the crew of Christopher Columbus' ship was just running out of things to give them. And in the end, the sailors thought they were going to starve because the natives stopped giving them food. And Christopher Columbus was down in his office, and he had an almanac, and he looked at his almanac, and astonishingly, in the almanac, it said there was going to be a lunar eclipse that evening. And this is a lovely story. So Christopher Columbus goes on the deck and shouts out and calls the natives of this island around, and he says, "My God is very displeased with you, and he'll bring a disaster upon you unless you give us food." And they all laughed at him. And he said, "My God will show his displeasure when the moon rises this evening. It will be the color of blood." And they all went away laughing. And then the moon rose and it was the color of blood. And apparently Christopher Columbus records in his logbook, the natives came bearing armfuls of food, more food than we could eat. And so that's a remarkable story, which is a remarkable true story, all recorded in Christopher Columbus' logbook. So, the moon turns to blood means a lunar eclipse, and a graphic one. So what's the scientific explanation of this? Well, some of you will know this. So at a lunar eclipse, the moon is in the Earth's shadow. So there's a sun on one side, and then the moon, sun on one side, Earth, and the moon over here. Moon's in the Earth's shadow. And geometrically, no sunlight should reach the moon. But in fact, some sunlight does reach the moon by refraction, it's called. So the sunlight's actually bent through the Earth's atmosphere, and some sunlight reaches the moon. And that light which reaches the moon has gone through a long path length of the Earth's atmosphere. And our atmosphere scatters the light as it goes through, and it scatters the blue end of the spectrum more than the red end of the spectrum. So that's the reason the sky appears blue. If everyone was wonder why the sky appears blue, it's because the Earth's atmosphere is scattering the blue light towards you in all directions, and so the sky appears blue. And the setting sun then appears red because the blue end of the spectrum has been lost. So the setting sun appears red, and that red light goes onto the moon. So when the light is bent round, the light which reaches the moon's surface is red light that's then reflected back to us, and we see the moon as red in an eclipse. It isn't always red, depends on atmospheric conditions, but very frequently it is red. And this is a photograph. I knew this person, that's why I attached it. It's an amateur photographer called Eric Strack in Liverpool. And this is a typical photograph on an eclipse moon. It goes this sort of beautiful blood red color. So what is interesting is I've read as many, I went into a library, a religious library at Tyndale House in Cambridge, and I read all the commentaries on Acts chapter 2 about the moon being turned to blood, and not one of them says this could have been a lunar eclipse. And I think that's because, people who write biblical commentaries are not scientists, because if a scientist had written it, then I think they probably would have said this could have been the lunar eclipse that's being hinted at here. The person who comes closest to saying this is F.F. Bruce, and this is what he says. He says, it was little more than 7 weeks since the people in Jerusalem had indeed seen the sun turned into darkness during the early afternoon of our Lord's crucifixion. And on the same afternoon, the Paschal full moon may well have appeared blood red in the sky in consequence of that preternatural gloom. So he almost gets there, but it was in fact in consequence of a lunar eclipse. I put Physics Steps, Arizona State University at the bottom here to remind myself to say, I first realized this when I was thinking about these events and what everything and what they meant. And I was visiting Arizona State University for 3 months to work with a great friend of mine there called John Spence. And one day I walked to the top floor of the physics department in Arizona State University, and there were all these photographs of stars and planets. And there was this beautiful photograph of a blood red eclipsed moon. And I saw this and I thought, gosh, could this be what Peter is talking about in Acts chapter 2? So that was just one of these lucky, or lucky in quotes, experiences which put me onto what I think was the right track for explaining this passage of Peter's. So we now ask the question, if we say, if this is the right interpretation, and there was a lunar eclipse on the evening of the crucifixion, then was there indeed a lunar eclipse visible from Jerusalem at Passover time in AD 26 to 36? So just as you can calculate future eclipses, so you can back calculate past eclipses. And again, you have to do this taking into account long-term changes in the Earth's rate of rotation. And what astronomers have done, they can calculate some of these long-term changes, and other ones, they use ancient Babylonian and Chinese eclipse records to actually refine these calculations. And so we've got the most accurate calculations available that Graham Waddington used. And so this is the question to ask. In the period AD 26 to 36, well, this is the answer, right? In the period AD 26 to 36, there was one and only one lunar eclipse at Passover time visible from Jerusalem. So there's a unique solution to this problem. And it's remarkable there is one of them, one eclipse, but one was visible in Jerusalem. And the question is, what date was this? And it was Friday, the 3rd of April, AD 33. Right, so it's quite remarkable, really, that the two methods we use to look for the date of the crucifixion, they're totally independent. The method that I used in the first talk I gave, was this elimination method, and now there's a totally different method which gives you exactly the same answer. So this interpretation of Acts 2, which I started by saying was tentative, looks as if it is in fact correct. I just find it quite remarkable that this has happened. When we did this work, we thought we were the first people to do this work. And then maybe a year or so afterwards, someone told us we weren't the first, and that someone called Hind had published a paper in Nature in 1872, in which he said on one of the possible dates of the crucifixion, there was an eclipse of there was an eclipse of the moon. Isn't this interesting? And then he says, but unfortunately, it wasn't visible from Jerusalem. And so everyone forgot about this paper. They thought it wasn't visible from Jerusalem, then, so what? It's not important. Hind was not aware of these long-term changes in the Earth's rate of rotation. So Hind used the same equations of motion that everyone else did at the time. And his calculations were correct if the moon had, correct if the Earth's rotation rate didn't change. But when you put in our more accurate calculations, then it shows that this eclipse was very much visible from Jerusalem. And what's interesting here is that it's only our generation who's got access to these more accurate equations that can say this, that this eclipse was visible from Jerusalem. So in a sense, we're a sort of special generation, because the people who were at the crucifixion would have witnessed this if what we're saying is true. And then since then, no one else has been able to say this happened because they haven't had the accurate enough equations apart from our generation. So it's been the last 50 years or so that we've been able to say this. And you may not be able to see this very clearly. This is Graham Waddington's attempt at drawing what the lunar eclipse looked like. It was a very special lunar eclipse because the moon, when it rose, was eclipsed. And it was eclipsed over the Mount of Olives, which is, sort of significant sort of place. And most lunar eclipses, we don't see. Most lunar eclipses occur in the middle of the night. Unless you stay up and wait, you just don't see them. There's a nice scene in either play or film of Fiddler on the Roof, where the people get up onto the roof of their flat roof of their house, and it's Passover time, and they watch the sun set, and then they spin round by 180 degrees, and they watch the moon rise, and then they go off and eat their Passover meal. And so people for Passover were looking for the sun to set and the moon to rise, so they could go and eat their Passover meal. So a lot of people would have seen this lunar eclipse rising. And what, in a sense, is more remarkable still, and I'm careful not to push things too hard here, but the lunar eclipse, in fact, was partial, and it was a top half which was eclipsed. And so the moon would have risen, as drawn here, if you can see it, it was a red color when half of it was above half of it was above the Mount of Olives, right? And the other half was not in the umbra or penumbra, and it would have put a normal color. And in a sense, the symbolism is very precise here, because at the crucifixion, Jesus was eclipsed, but it was not a total eclipse. It was a partial eclipse. And because Jesus then rose again, if you believe that. So a partial eclipse is an exact sort of symbolism you would expect to have, as it were, for this, and this is what you get. So days of the crucifixion, two very different independent methods give Friday the 3rd of April, AD 33. So I'd now like to come back to this different calendar theory of the Last Supper. So what we said, this date, 3rd of April, AD 33, it means that John's chronology is correct, and either the synoptics is wrong, or else they could possibly be right if they were describing the Last Supper using a different calendar. And is there any evidence for this? And what was that different calendar, if there is? So did these four Gospels use a different calendar? And in particular, did John use the official Jewish calendar the priests of the temple used, in which the Last Supper was before the Passover meal, but did Jesus choose to use an earlier Jewish calendar in which the Last Supper was a real Passover meal, as described by Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And so were the two different calendars used? And a question which, of course, other people will ask is, why should the date of the Passover feast change? And it's not a minor matter to do this. So the Passover feast, very special, commemorated a particular day in history when, at the time of the Exodus, God passed over the Jewish people and punished, as it were, the Egyptian people. And, it's a special day like a birthday. And you don't easily change your birthday. Once you've got your birthday, it's sort of fixed. And what put this change of date in my mind was my holiday visit to Greece some years ago. So what had happened was, it was Easter time, and my family had gone to church in England and Easter Sunday, and then we'd gone to Greece. And the following Sunday, we passed this church, and there's lots of singing outside and everything. And in fact, the church was so full, people were gathered outside the church. And I said, what's going on? And they said, we're celebrating Easter. And I said, no, 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 we celebrated Easter a week ago. Why are you celebrating it now? And then they explained to me, which I should have known anyway, that they were Greek Orthodox and they used a different calendar to celebrate Easter from the ones that we do in the Western churches. And so that's how I knew about different calendars. So what's this story? Well, so today, Catholics and Protestants celebrate Easter Sunday on a particular day, and that's different from Greek and Russian Orthodox Christians. And the reason is that, and you probably I expect you know this, that Catholics and Protestants calculate the dates of Easter using the Gregorian calendar, which was the Julian calendar existed before that, and then Pope Gregory reformed the Julian calendar. Orthodox Christians calculate the date of Easter using this earlier Julian calendar. Now, what was called the Gregorian calendar reform occurred in AD 1582. And before that calendar reform, everyone celebrated Easter on the same day because they all used the Julian calendar. Then after the Julian calendar reform, the Orthodox churches said, we're going to use this new Gregorian calendar for our everyday life, but for our religious ceremonies and feasts, we're going to use the Julian calendar because we always use the Julian calendar. That's our tradition. That's the true calendar to use. And so the Orthodox Christians still today use the Julian calendar because they think that's the right calendar to use. Whereas the Catholics and Protestants just went for the Gregorian calendar. And so they use this different Reform calendar. And so that's why I observed Easter Sunday on one day in England, and then a week later, Easter Sunday in Greece. So the same celebration of Easter, but celebrated on two different dates because of two different calendars. So let's look into the origin of the official Jewish calendar. And it's such a pleasure to be giving this talk to many people who may be Jewish, because there's a lot to understand the New Testament properly. We need to understand the Old Testament. So when did the official Jewish calendar start? Well, there's strong evidence it started when the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon. And they were in captivity in Babylon between 596 and 537 BC. Now, why do we say that? Well, the first reason is, if the nation was taken into captivity in the ancient world, they were essentially forced to adopt the calendar of the people who have captured them. And we are pretty sure this was the case with the exile into Babylon, because the names of the calendar that Jews use today, the names of the months, are based on these ancient Babylonian month names. So, for example, the first calendar month in the Babylonian calendar is called Nisanu, and then the Jewish first day of the month in this is Nisan, and that's clearly based on Nisanu. And so this is the date when the Jews adopted the calendar they use today, and each day is a sunset to sunset day, and that is the official calendar of Jews. So what calendar did they use before they went into captivity in Babylon. And I'm going to call this a pre-exilic calendar. And when we did this work, people thought that this might be the case, but they had no idea what this pre-exilic calendar might be. So this is the hunch I had. And so I then said, let's go back to the time of Moses for the first Passover. What calendar would Moses have used? And the Jews were in Egypt, and so they would again have been forced to use the Egyptian calendars for their everyday life and religious festivals. So the Egyptians had two calendars, and they're very well documented. For civil purposes, they used a solar calendar, so a calendar based on the sun. But for religious festivals, the Egyptians used a lunar calendar, and that in fact was the original calendar of the Egyptians. It dates back to 3000 BC, and it was still being used in AD 180. And the Egyptian lunar calendar differed in a fundamentally different way, or differed in a different way from the Jewish lunar calendar, because the Jewish lunar calendar was the first day of the month was the first day of visibility of the new lunar crescent, and you first see the new lunar crescent after sunset, so it's a sunset to sunset day. The Egyptian lunar calendar was the first day of invisibility of the old lunar crescent, and you first see the old lunar crescent in the morning sky, and so they had a sunrise to sunrise day. So basically, the Egyptians would have people with good eyesight who were tasked to look at the moon every day of the month. And the first day they saw it was invisible, they said, this is a new day of the month. So the month started, the lunar month in Egypt started on a different day from the lunar month in Israel. And the Egyptian lunar calendar was sunrise to sunrise, and the official Jewish calendar later on was sunset to sunset. And so my suggestion is that Moses used the Egyptian lunar calendar. And if you look at what Exodus says, when the Passover is instituted in Exodus chapter 12, I think, God says to Moses, this month will be for you the first month of the year. And so God is essentially saying, you know, keep the calendar you've got, except shift the first month to Passover time, which was March or April in our calendar. Whereas the Egyptian lunar calendar, the first month corresponds to the rising of Sirius, the dog star. So you know, it's a different first month, but otherwise it's the same lunar calendar. So there was a transfer. So when you change calendars, as we did with Easter in the Orthodox churches and Protestant churches, when you change calendars, then you transfer feast dates from one calendar to another. So, for example, if you have a festival that started at sunrise, where the day started at sunrise, to a day that started at sunset, then you automatically have to transfer some feast dates. So we'll just look at that for this simple case of the Passover in the Jewish calendar we have today, the Passover, and at the time of Jesus, the official calendar, the Passover meal was eaten. The Passover sacrifice was sacrificed on 14 Nisan in the evening. Sorry, let me say it again. The Passover sacrifice was on the afternoon of Nisan 14, and then sunset happened. And then after sunset and moonrise, the Passover meal was eaten. That was on Nisan 15. That's a sunset to sunset day. If you go from a sunrise to sunrise day, then the meal, the lamb is sacrificed and the meal is eaten on the same day, right? And so you then have to transfer the Passover meal, the first day of the Passover meal, from Nisan 15 to 14 or 14 to 15. So there's a double, and if you have two calendars running side by side, as we do for Easter at this time, you have a double dating of the Passover feast. You say the Passover feast is on either of these two dates, depending on the calendars. And in fact, Egypt changed its calendars as double dating, and we have double dating of our Easter. And so this pre-exilic calendar, which I believe the Jews held until they went into captivity in Babylon, it wasn't eliminated then. Some Jews kept using it, just as in the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Christians keep using their original calendar. And what I found was that in the 1st century AD, the Samaritans, the Zealots, some Essenes and some Galileans were still using this pre-exilic calendar. We've got evidence for that. And so for Jesus to choose the pre-exilic calendar to celebrate his Last Supper as a Passover meal would not have been particularly unusual because other people were also doing this. Now, are there any clues in the Gospels that the 4 Gospel writers use different calendars? And I think there are, but you only see them if you're looking for them. So let me say what I think they are. I mean, tiny clues, they're hints, but they're hints that the people at the time, the original readers, would have picked up. So how does John introduce the last week of Jesus? This is what he says. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem. How strange to say the Jewish Passover, because everyone knew the Passover was Jewish. No one else celebrates the Passover. No one else calls this in the Bible the Jewish Passover apart from John. So why did John say it? Why use this unnecessary word Jewish? Well, I think, this is my tentative suggestion, what John is saying is, I'm using the official Jewish Passover when I'm describing the last week of Jesus. That's why he says it, right? It's this, at the time, a strong hint. When it was almost time for the official Jewish Passover, is what it's saying. Many went up from the country. And then, that fits in to only John using this, and he's using the official calendar. How did the Synoptics introduce their Last Supper? Well, there's a hint there as well. And this is what they say. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Now, a very famous biblical scholar called Boltman says Mark 14:12 is completely impossible. And a lot of commentators agree. Why did he say this? Because, as we saw in the previous talk, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was Nisan 15, and the sacrifice, and the lamb was sacrificed on Nisan 14. So this statement at first sight makes no sense. It makes no sense if they're using a evening to evening day, but if they're using a morning to morning day, then it makes perfect sense. It would be the same day. And so I think this is a clear clue that the Synoptic Gospels are using a morning to morning day, and they're telling us this before they describe what's happening. So, as I say here, this sentence at first sight is equivalent to saying on Boxing Day when it was customary to prepare dinner for Christmas Day, right? And they also use the word customary. Mark uses customary. What he's saying is it was the custom. It's the historical custom to do this. And that's, so it's the pre-exilic calendar which is being used. So he's using a sunrise to sunrise day calendar. Why did Jesus choose to do this? So the Synoptic Gospel are telling us Jesus chose to use the original Passover calendar of Moses, the pre-exilic calendar, to celebrate his Last Supper Passover meal. He did it because he wanted to do this on the exact anniversary of the first Passover of Moses. And why should he want to do this? Because he was identifying himself as the new Moses who would introduce a new covenant. So at the original Passover, at the original Exodus, Moses introduced the first covenant, and then Jesus says when he talks at the Last Supper, he says, I'm telling you a new covenant in my blood. So he's introducing a new covenant. So he's identifying himself as the new Moses. So so this is what we've got, these two different calendars, and both the Synoptics and John indicate that they're using different calendars. So we can do the astronomical calculations again, and we can say if the first day of the month was not the first observation of the new lunar crescent, but was the first observation of the was the first observation with the first invisibility of the old lunar crescent, we can then we can calculate this pre-exilic calendar. And when we do that, something rather surprising happens, and the date of the Last Supper on Nisan 15 in the pre-exilic calendar was Wednesday, 1 April AD 33. Right, so that's what comes out of the science. That's what comes out of the mathematics. So we're saying that Jesus held his Last Supper on a Wednesday rather than traditional Thursday. And so this actually, when we published the paper, this actually caused newspapers like the Times and so on to actually report this, to say that the Last Supper was written on a Wednesday. So, John's Gospel is correct. It was before the official Passover, and Jesus died as the first Passover lamb was being slain. And people actually, they find this hard to believe, to the extent that they can misrepresent what the Bible says. So I was listening to a Sunday morning service, which was a communion service. I said 2 weeks ago, that's when I wrote the slide, 2 weeks ago on BBC Radio 4. And the minister leading the communion appeared to be reading from the Bible. He said, the Lord Jesus, on the day before he died, took bread and broke it. Nowhere does the Bible say that. What the words of Paul, which are usually used, and the Bible actually says, the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, not the night before he died. And so that would have been the case. That the Last Supper took place, and then he was arrested after that. So it's the same night as he was betrayed, he took bread. So we have these key dates in Easter week. The Last Supper on Wednesday, 1st of April, AD 33, Crucifixion, Friday, 3rd of April, AD 33, Resurrection, Sunday, 5th of April, AD 33. What are the consequences of these dates? Well, the first consequence is the problem of missing Wednesday solved. So there's no missing Wednesday, because on Wednesday, Jesus had his Last Supper. And earlier that day, his disciples were preparing for him to eat the Passover at his Last Supper. So no missing Wednesday. We now have time, because Last Supper on the Wednesday, Crucifixion on a Friday. We now have time for all the events between the Last Supper and Crucifixion to occur. We have an extra day, which is what you need for them all to occur. And then the trials by the Sanhedrin were legal trials. So the first trial of Jesus was on Thursday during the daytime. And then I think Jesus was imprisoned overnight. And then Friday morning, the Sanhedrin met early on in the morning and confirmed their decision. So there's no trial by night. They condemned Jesus to death on one day and confirmed that decision the next day. So that is it. So this is I mean, this is clearly controversial, and it's not rewriting the Bible at all. It's actually saying the four Gospels all agree. They're using different calendars, and we can use science to actually reconstruct both the official Jewish calendar and the pre-exilic calendar. We can reconstruct them as they were in the 1st century AD at the time of Jesus. And Wednesday pops out of these calculations as the day you have in a pre-exilic calendar. And then the conclusions really clear up all these other problems to do with the Last Supper and with Passion Week of Jesus. So finally, was the death of Jesus built into the origin of the universe? So we have statements in the Bible which clearly indicate that this was the case. So Revelation says, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. And Peter says Jesus was chosen before the creation of the world. So what these two writers are saying is that when God created the world, he built into the creation of the world his redemption story. So that was built into the world before the creation. And so, as I said in the last talk, a person cannot easily determine when he's going to be killed by others. But this was just built in, that Jesus would be dying at the same time as the first part of the lambs was slain. So Jesus was the Lamb of God who was slain for us. So there's this exact analogy. The moon was turned to blood on the evening of the crucifixion, which fulfilled this Joel prophecy made at least 500 years earlier. And so that was something which was, as it were, predetermined. And so before the creation of the universe, God's plan of salvation was in place. And so these events, I think, were preordained. And so it's suggestive of how God acts in our world. And what I believe is I think that certain events were fixed and preordained. So I think the coming of Jesus, his birth in Bethlehem, another astronomical event occurred here, which was the Star of Bethlehem, which I think you can identify today. So I think it was a comet in 5 BC. So this was showing that the birth of Christ was of cosmic significance. We have another astronomical event, which is death, which is this lunar eclipse. And I should say, you can say, how did this lunar eclipse occur? Did God tweak the orbits of the sun or the moon, or did he vary the rate of rotation of the earth to make this eclipse occur? And the scientific answer is no, because we use the standard equations of how the earth and the moon and the sun behave and run them backwards. So nothing was tweaked, nothing was changed. The science happened as it should happen, and so nothing was changed in that sense. So for this to actually happen, it had to be built in to the Big Bang, if that's how everything started. And so you get a lot of really, I think, really sort of magnificent thoughts about what God was doing, which comes out of this study that we've been doing about the last week of Jesus. So some key conclusions are the gospel accounts of the last week of Jesus, which many biblical scholars say are full of contradictions. I don't think that's the case. I was open to it being the case, but I really don't think, I think they're in remarkable agreement. And science and the Bible in combination we've used to work hand in hand to solve the thorniest problem in the New Testament. And it's also my belief that there are certain events which were fixed, like the coming of Jesus, but then a lot of other events are not fixed, because otherwise prayer would be meaningless. So if prayer is going to be meaningful, then there has to be flexibility in the universe. And what's fixed and what's flexible, I don't know. But I think the coming of Jesus, his coming was at a certain time in a certain place in history. And I'm just saying there's some further details in this book I wrote, but I'm not asking you to buy it. Get it from a library, right? Then it's free of charge and it's in the library for other people to read. So that would be a good thing to do. And then my next talk will be, can we believe in the resurrection in our scientific age? Thank you very much for listening.